They dug under the enemy, packed the tunnel with explosives, blew a hole straight through the Confederate line, and then got trapped inside their own success. That is what makes the Battle of the Crater so insane. This was not a failed plan in the usual sense. The mine worked. The explosion worked. The enemy line really did dream about in trench warfare, shock, surprise, and an opening. And then, almost unbelievably, that opening became a pit. That pit became a traffic jam, and that traffic jam became a killing ground. So the real question is not why the explosion mattered. That part is easy. The real question is how one of the most creative battlefield ideas of the Civil War turned into one of its most humiliating disasters. By the summer of 1864, the war around Petersburg had become a siege. Trenches, artillery, dirt, heat, exhaustion. Petersburg mattered because it fed Richmond. If the Union broke through there, the pressure on Lee's army could become unbearable. But that was the problem. Everyone knew a direct assault on prepared earthworks was murder. So, when men in the 48th Pennsylvania, many of them former coal miners, proposed tunneling under the Confederate line, it sounded almost absurd. Then they actually did it. Under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants, they drove a tunnel hundreds of feet forward beneath Confederate positions. At the end of it, they packed in thousands of pounds of black powder. Burnside's plan was simple in theory and fragile in practice. Blow the mine, shock the defenders, send assault troops around the crater, not into it, push fast through the gap, take the high ground beyond, turn a blast into a breakthrough. That last part mattered more than the explosion itself. The crater was never supposed to be the objective. It was supposed to be the doorway. And this is where the disaster really begins, before the mine even goes off. Burnside had prepared black troops to lead the assault. They had trained for it. They were taught to move around the crater, widen the gap, and keep the attack from bunching up. But at the last moment, higher command changed the plan. The trained lead force was pulled out, and an unprepared white division under James Ledlie was sent in instead. That decision gutted the whole operation. A plan built on precision was suddenly handed to men who had not rehearsed it properly, under a commander who was exactly the wrong man for a job like this. It was the kind of change that looks manageable on paper and becomes deadly the second real chaos arrives. And before that chaos explodes, do me one favor. If you like battles where human error turns a smart idea into a complete nightmare, hit like, subscribe, and drop another military disaster in the comments, because this channel is full of moments exactly like this. Even the detonation almost failed. The fuse went out. 2 volunteers had to crawl back into the tunnel, relight it, and get out before the whole thing blew. Then, at 4004 in the morning on July 30, 1864, the earth erupted. The blast was monstrous. Confederate soldiers' guns, timbers, and dirt were launched into the air. A massive crater tore open the line. Men nearby were killed instantly. Others were stunned, buried, or thrown into total confusion. For a few precious moments, the Confederate front was broken and disoriented. This was the window. This was the moment everything had been built for, and the Union attack wasted it. Instead of flowing around the crater and driving forward, the leading troops moved badly, hesitated, and then did the one thing they absolutely were not supposed to do. They went down into the crater. It sounds idiotic when you say it like that, but on the battlefield, it made a terrible kind of sense. Think about what those soldiers saw. A giant explosion. Smoke everywhere. Dirt raining down. Broken bodies. Officers yelling. Gunfire starting again. In that kind of confusion, men do not always follow the elegant version of the plan. They follow the ground in front of them, and the giant hole in the enemy line looked, for a few seconds, like shelter. So the first men climbed in. Then more followed. Then more. Had once enough, men made the same bad decision. It stopped being one mistake and became the battle itself. That is the psychology of collapse in combat. People copy what is visible when command becomes invisible. A soldier may not hear the full order. He may not even know where his regiment is anymore. But he can see the man 10 feet ahead of him. If that man jumps into the crater, others jump too, not because they are cowards, not because they are stupid. Because, in confusion, the nearest action becomes the safest-looking action. But the crater was not shelter. It was a trap. Its walls were steep and uneven. Men could get in much more easily than they could get out. Clay, loose dirt, shattered debris, wounded men, dead men, broken muskets, splintered timber, everything collected in the same place. The more Union troops entered, the worse it became. What should have been a passageway turned into a bowl packed with human bodies. And while Union troops jammed themselves into the worst position on the field, the Confederates recovered. That part is crucial. The explosion did not end the defense. It shocked it. Surviving Confederate troops regrouped fast. They moved to the flanks. They occupied trench lines and higher ground around the crater. Reinforcements under William Mahone came in hard, and once they did, the geometry of the battlefield became brutal. The Union troops were stuck below. The Confederates were firing from above and from the sides. At that point, the crater was basically a giant target marker. Rifle fire poured down into it. Artillery hit the packed mass. Every minute the Union remained there, the position got worse. There was no clean route to deploy, no momentum, no visibility, and no real way to reorganize while under plunging fire. This is where battlefield failure becomes system failure. A breakthrough attack depends on movement, direction, and control. At the crater, all three broke at once. Units mixed together. Officers lost control of their men. Orders could not move clearly through smoke, noise, and panic. Reinforcements arrived and entered the same clogged zone instead of fixing the problem. Instead of expanding the breach, the Union Army kept feeding bodies into a hole it could no longer use. And the leadership above that mess was awful. Ledlie, the division commander who should have been driving the attack forward, was nowhere near where he needed to be. Accounts place him far behind the line while the assault unraveled. Burnside could not reassert control. Meade was furious. Grant saw enough to understand what was happening, but by the time senior commanders recognized the scale of the disaster, the field had already swallowed the plan. Then came one of the bitterest parts of the battle. The black troops originally trained for the assault were eventually sent in anyway after the situation had already collapsed. Some fought with real determination and pushed farther than earlier waves, but by then, the battlefield was poisoned. The crater and nearby trenches were already choked with confusion, casualties, and broken formations. They were being sent into a disaster that had already taken physical shape, and once they entered the fight, the violence became even uglier. The combat around the crater turned savage. Sources vary in the details. But what is clear is that black Union soldiers suffered especially brutal treatment. The battle was no longer just a tactical failure. It had become a moral one too. Rage, fear, hatred, and chaos all compressing into one small piece of ground. By midday, the attack was finished. The crater had become a furnace of smoke, dirt, blood, and heat. The Union had lost thousands of men. Confederate losses were much lower. Petersburg did not fall. The siege continued. Burnside's career never recovered. Ledlie was disgraced, and one of the most inventive operations of the war became a textbook example of how not to exploit success. That is the real lesson of the crater. The explosion did not fail. The plan did not fail because the idea was foolish. It failed because a smart plan was handed to the wrong men, altered at the wrong time, and then abandoned to confusion the moment reality hit. The breach existed. The opportunity was real, But opportunity in war is worthless if nobody can control what happens in the next 60 seconds. At the crater, the Union Army opened the enemy line with engineering brilliance and then lost the battle inside the hole it created. This was not just a defeat, it was a breakthrough turning into a trap because command, movement, and discipline collapsed at the exact moment they mattered most.